Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Clean Health Masterclass. Today, we have one of our very own, Stefan Ianev, joining us for a conversation that has been in high demand. We're going to be talking about all things hypertrophy, what it is, how to program it, nutrition for hypertrophy, and more. But before we dive into our conversation, for our students who may not be familiar with you, Stefan, can you give us a brief overview of your career, your history with Clean Health, and what you're up to today?
Sure. So yeah, I started in the industry probably about 20 years ago now. So around 2002, 2003, um, I basically started on as as an independent trainer around and I quickly sort of found out in my journey as a trainer that the education that you get through the minimum certification really wasn't all that much. So I went then decided to pursue further studying. I went and did my bachelor's at uni. After I did that, I still kind of felt like I didn't really know enough. So I went and then did my master's. And again, look, uni was great, but you learn a lot of like the foundation and the physiology that then later helps you understand principles and understand things when you read them. But even then, I still felt like I didn't know quite enough or as much as I wanted to. So then I went to pursue as a trainer further learning through some of the greatest minds in the industry, like Charles Poliquin, Milo Sarcev, Lane Norton, all these guys I went on to learn from. And basically, it was around really, I'd say 2015. So from I started 2002, 2003, it was around 2015 where I really started to trust myself and my knowledge above anyone else, that I would listen to myself, and especially when it came to regards to my own training, because up until around 2010, 2015, that whole period, I worked with a coach myself. And
Gotcha.
that was also great. So I worked with some of the best coaches around the world. And that was a great learning experience. But you come to a point where, as a trainer, you get a lot thrown at you from every direction. And I think every trainer naturally goes through this phase of you're going to be very overwhelmed with everything that you learn and knowing what to believe, how to make sense of everything. But after a point of going through that, like I said, I think every trainer goes through that, you come out with like more clarity at the end. Everything starts to make sense after a while. You start to kind of deduct and through your own experience as well what works, what doesn't, what you form your own theories in a way. And yeah, for me, that turning point was around 215. That's kind of when I really decided to start trusting myself more in my own experiences. That year was the first year I did my own comp prep. So I had started competing a few years before, always under the guidance of other coaches, and it did okay. Always came or placed top three in like bodybuilding comps, but never won a show. And then that year was when I decided, oh, look, I'm going to trust myself. Started my prep end of 2015. 2016 won my first show. And then from then on, every show I've done, I've placed first. I've competed for another couple of years after that. That was just me, trusting myself.
Yeah.
But it took a bit to get to there. And as far as, I guess, my career as a trainer, around 2010 is when I started, when I got my first trainer to start working for me. By the time I came to Clean Health, I was at operating out of Anytime Fitness in Sydney CBD. I had 7 trainers working under me there. So I had my own business I was running there. And I was quite close with Dane from a few years back, from like 2010. I think we met at a Poliquin course and we'd always stayed in contact. I actually got mentored. He was one of the guys I got mentoring through as well.
Yeah.
And around 2014, he asked me if, I'd be interested in coming on board with Clean Health, doing the internal education, because it's already something I was doing with my guys internally.
Happy almost
And
10
then
years anniversary then, right?
it's
2024.
coming up. No, it's already been our 10-year anniversary as far as the Dane and I's friendship, but a Clean Health anniversary, it's coming up. Yeah,
Yeah.
soon. So to end of 2014, no, sorry, end of 2013, so beginning of 2014, that's when I came on board with Clean Health. Because he had aspirations of opening other gyms too, and he wanted me to come on and manage one of the gyms. So I came on board there, brought across my clientele, and from where we were operating, because it wasn't far. The 2 gyms were quite close in proximity. And I started there with the internal education with the trainers, basically continuing what I was doing at my other gym. And then we started venturing out and running more external education. So started first with Sydney-based workshops, and then started spreading to Melbourne, Gold Coast, and then from Australia it started spreading Hong Kong, China, then Europe, then United States. So for a good part of like 2015 to 2017, I was on tour quite a bit, doing the live events with Clean Health. And look, it was great. It was a bit, the touring schedule we had at that time was really intense though. There was some weeks I'd do 14 days in a row of teaching.
Oof.
There was one trip in Kuwait, yeah, I taught like 14
You got to
days
dust
straight.
off those gears, Stefan, for our live events coming in 2023.
What was that?
You got to dust off those education presenter skills again because we're coming back hot
Yeah,
in
yeah. I
2023.
think it's like riding a bike. You won't really forget.
Yeah,
Um, so it was good, but then I did part with Clean Health for a short while, because I was sort of going in different directions. They were full on with the education, like with the traveling and touring. I was ready to settle down, have a family.
yeah,
So I went off, did my own thing, and then as a trainer, they continued doing their own thing. We stayed in contact though. I did some contractor work for them. Um, and then I've been back full time with Clean Health though since COVID, since the beginning of COVID. Basically, I came back on full time as head of research and development, which was really good timing. Obviously, with COVID, gyms and everything shutting down, it was just a good opportunity. It also allowed me to work mostly from home.
yeah,
So, and that's been good. I still do go to the gym in a couple of times a week, because I think it's just good to keep your skills sharp, to stay
yeah,
in the game. I like also interacting with people. I don't want to sit behind a screen all day.
yeah, exactly.
So I do go into the gym a couple of days a week. But mostly like my full-time gig is Clean Health, doing all the research for developing our courses, and then just a few online coaching clients and just a few face-to-face clients. So that's kind of where I'm at today, basically. I guess almost 10 years later, you can say.
And that is why we are very happy to have you on today's masterclass. And no person that's better to talk about today's topic than you. So we're going to dive right into talking about what is hypertrophy. So give our students a little bit of background on what hypertrophy is, and then we'll go from there.
Well, this is, look, at my absolute favorite topic. And I think what drove that is really being a skinny kid, you know. And even to this day, training young skinny kids, I would probably say, is my favorite thing, because we tend to relate really well to people, or that we relate to. So we tend to be in good rapport. Like when they ask, or when a trainer needs to think about who is your ideal client, one place I guess to look is, you know, who are you yourself, and a lot of times it's who we were starting out when we started our journey. And for me, I guess building muscle these days, it comes around easily. I mean, I guess because I've changed my mindset around, and I've learned about building muscle. So these days, I'd say confident I build muscle rather easily, and I can put pounds on people quite easily. But it wasn't always the case. It was a journey that I had to go through. So look, in a nutshell, I guess, what is hypertrophy? It's just an enlargement in the cross-sectional area and the volume of the muscle tissue. Okay, so the cross-sectional area being, if you take, like, say, the muscle, you just run a line through it, chop it, and that's the cross-sectional area that you see. But you also need to consider too, it's not just cross-sectional area. And this is the problem with some studies. They look at cross-sectional area, but not muscle volume. And they're
Hmm.
two different things. The muscle and that's because there's different types of muscle hypertrophy. Okay. So we have, so the smallest functional units of a muscle cell are the sarcomeres, right? So the muscle fibers are made up of sarcomeres. Now, we can lay down these sarcomeres in parallel,
Yeah,
like that, like next on top of each other, and that tends to increase the cross-sectional area of the muscle. So you could more say the belly of the muscle. And that's one type of hypertrophy. It's the most commonly accepted model of hypertrophy, like parallel hypertrophy. More recently, we've also identified there's another type of hypertrophy, which is called serial hypertrophy, which is when the sarcomeres or myofibrils are aligned not parallel but serial.
yeah,
Okay, and that actually tends to manifest in more distal hypertrophy, so more hypertrophy in the distal portion of the muscle. So if you increase, for example, distal hypertrophy, and you look at cross-sectional area, you might not have a very large increase in cross-sectional area, but if you measure muscle volume, you get a larger increase in volume.
Yeah.
Um, so that's why when we're talking about hypertrophy, we're really talking about the enlargement of the muscle cells, both in terms of cross-sectional area and the volume. And for the most part, it happens to be an enlargement in the existing muscle fibers, that's what hypertrophy is. There's also hyperplasia, which is, when fibers split and you get, formation of new muscle fibers. But to be quite honest, that's very minor, if or negligible, if it all exists in humans. There's not a lot of good data to substantiate that hyperplasia actually exists in humans. So most of the growth we can comfortably attribute to hypertrophy, the
Yeah.
enlargement of the existing muscle fibers.
And so, what is the main difference between training for hypertrophy versus training for strength?
So it's actually not that different. Like if you look at the most recent literature, the optimal hypertrophy program actually doesn't look that far from the optimal strength program. That's more and more what we're finding. And
Yeah.
that's probably one of the reasons you see consistently that some of the biggest guys are the strongest guys too. Now that's
Yeah.
not always the case. Obviously, you see like Olympic weightlifters, 130-pound female Olympic lifters cleaning, jerking 225
Yeah.
plus pounds. So there is um, a neurological component to strength training,
Yeah.
and that neurological component actually requires you to lift heavy weights to increase the motor unit recruitment, the frequency at which those motor units are firing, and basically lifting heavy weights itself is a skill.
Yeah.
Okay, so lifting heavy weights itself is a skill, and it takes time to condition your body to lifting heavy weights and to acclimatize to the heavy weights. There's a skill component to strength training, just like there is, a basketball player shooting free throws. There's also specific adaptations that tend to happen in the tendons. One of the adaptations to heavy strength training is an increase in tendon stiffness.
Gotcha.
Now, the reason that's favorable for strength is because the stiffer the tendon, the more force you can transmit through muscle to bone, right? And then obviously the muscle pulls on the tendon pulls on the bone. That's how we create action at a joint. So tendon stiffness is a very big and underlooked factor in developing muscle strength. So to develop that skill of lifting heavy weights, to increase motor unit recruitment, which at some point, to be honest, most advanced lifters max out their motor unit recruitment. It's not the limiting factor. But then there's rate coding, the rate at which we fire those motor units, the
Yeah.
increase in tendon stiffness. These are all adaptations, neurological and adaptations that are happening as well in the tissues that require the lifting or the use of heavy loads. Now, hypertrophy is also a factor that contributes to strength, because
Yeah.
obviously the bigger the size of the muscle, the bigger the motor, the more potential force that muscle can generate. So hypertrophy is definitely a factor in muscle growth, but we do also see studies which show, that compare different rep ranges,
Yeah.
and you see similar hypertrophy or exact same hypertrophy between different rep ranges, but the lower rep range or the heavier loads always get stronger. So
Yeah.
it's not always 100% correlated. You very much can hypertrophy with lighter loads without having as big of an increase in strength, because you're not
Yeah.
getting those neurological adaptations. But provided, you're doing enough volume, that's the main difference. For strength, you need to lift heavy weights. For hypertrophy, you don't really necessarily need to lift heavy weights, provided, you approach failure. So with hypertrophy, the most important thing is you approach failure. When we approach failure, that's when those highest threshold motor units are being engaged.
Yeah.
And that occurs, doesn't matter whether we're performing 5 reps or 10 reps or 15 or 20 reps. As you approach failure, those last 5 reps or so, you are recruiting those highest threshold motor units. Now, these are the highest threshold motor units. They innervate the most amount of muscle fibers.
Yeah.
Okay. And they have the most potential for muscle growth. So if you look at, I guess, different type of motor units, you have low threshold motor units. They only innervate a couple dozen muscle fibers, and they're all slow twitch fibers. So low threshold motor units do not hypertrophy at all. They have like no potential to hypertrophy. Then if you have your intermediate threshold motor units, they, govern maybe several hundred muscle fibers, again, mostly slow twitch fibers. So they only have limited potential to hypertrophy. Your highest threshold motor units govern thousands of muscle fibers, and a good majority of those, or chunk of those, up to 50% or more, being fast twitch fibers. Not all of them are. So that's a misconception that high threshold fibers only govern fast twitch fibers. They don't. They also govern the slow twitch fibers, but majority is, of fast twitch, or at least up to 50% in some cases. So those are the muscle fibers that have the most potential for growth or for hypertrophy. So if we don't actually recruit those fibers in any given set, there's a limited muscle building, stimulus to that set. So as we approach failure, what doesn't, irrespective of the reps, we're basically ensuring that we are recruiting those highest threshold motor units and that we are delivering a growth stimulus.
As
So
a
that's why you go.
I was just going to say, as a coach and as an educator, right? One of the things that I think is a common question that we get from our students in our student group when it comes to helping your clients train to failure, especially online clients, how do you recommend explaining that to a client in order for them to get to that point where they are short of failure? How would you go about that as a coach?
So you don't need to go absolute failure.
Yeah,
You can stay within a couple of reps. Probably look, the muscle building stimulus from keeping 1 or 2 reps in the tank versus going to complete exhaustion. You could make the argument that, yeah, going to complete failure is a little bit more effective. You might get a couple of extra stimulating reps,
yeah,
but at what cost as well? That's what you got to factor in. At what cost does that come? And you have to, one thing you always have to look at when with any training stimulus is going to be the stimulus to fatigue ratio.
yeah,
So going to absolute failure is probably not necessary because it incurs a much larger level of fatigue versus keeping a rep or two in the tank.
yeah,
Um, and that what that allows you in essence to do if you keep a rep or two in the tank is to accumulate a bit more quality volume without fatiguing excessively, both within that workout and then also, for your next workout. So you don't have to rest as much before you do your next workout. So that's the thing. You don't have to go to complete failure, but you need to come close. You want those last. Basically, the condition that needs to be met is motor unit recruitment is proportional to your effort. So there needs to be a high degree of effort. Those last few reps, you need to be struggling. You need to be exerting yourself, even though you're not failing completely. And the bar needs to be moving rather slow.
yeah.
Okay,
Naturally, it just slows down. Yeah,
it has to, and the reason that's important is because intent needs to be high because that ensures full motor unit recruitment. The bar needs to be slow because it's an intrinsic property of the muscle fibers that when muscle fibers contract slow, they can generate more force. When they contract rapidly, they're just unable to generate as much force. This is the individual muscle fibers. And the reason that is, it has to do with the force velocity relationship. When you have a muscle fiber that contracts slow, there's more opportunity for the actin and myosin, the filaments of the muscle fibers, to bind and to exert force. So when a muscle is contracting slowly, it has the capacity for more actin and myosin cross bridges to form, so it has the capacity to generate more force. When the muscle is contracting fast, there's just less opportunity for actin and myosin to overlap, so you're unable to generate, or the muscle's fibers are unable to generate as much force. So
yeah,
that's why we need these two things. We need basically high level of effort and bar need to be moving slowly because you could very well take a lightweight and explode with that weight. And what we have found is even with loads as low as 50% of 1 RM, you can recruit the high threshold motor units. But
yeah.
because the bar is moving slowly, because the bar is moving so fast, there's just less opportunity for those muscle fibers to generate force. So when we do high velocity, light load training, there's a high level of motor unit recruitment, high level of rate coding. It's good for neurological adaptations, such as increasing rate of force development and power. But it's really not optimal for hypertrophies because the force on each individual muscle fiber, even though we're recruiting all the muscle fibers, the force on each individual muscle fiber is rather low.
Does it
So
matter between eccentric and concentric being slow
that's
or,
a great question.
or
That's a
both?
great question. That's purely on the concentric phase.
Gotcha.
That is purely on the concentric phase. So on the concentric phase, slower shortening velocity allows to generate more force or more torque. So that is why, and I'll come back around to the eccentric portion. I'll just clear up first the concentric.
Yeah.
When, in order for the for us to meet that criteria of optimal or high, like maximal motor unit recruitment and slow shortening velocity, you need to either be lifting a heavy load like 5 RM or less, or you need to be working with a submaximal load but to failure.
Yeah.
Purposefully slowing down your normal repetition tempo, like let's say purposely squeezing the muscle and lifting the weight slowly with a submaximal load, will not do it. And reason being is because motor unit recruitment is not maximal.
Gotcha.
So just like lifting fast weights, like light weights explosively, really doesn't do all that much to stimulate growth, because even though motor unit recruitment is maximal, the force per muscle fiber is not, it's low. Likewise, if you take a submaximal load and you lift it very slow, the force per individual muscle fiber is high because you're lifting slow, but then you're only recruiting a small portion of muscle fibers, and you don't have maximal motor unit recruitment because it's a submaximal weight.
Yeah.
That is why the only way we actually get any muscle building stimulus out of the lighter weights is by going to failure or close to it. Because by going to failure or close to it, what we're ensuring is happening is motor unit recruitment is maximal, is because we have to push harder to try to overcome that resistance, and because naturally at that point the bar is moving slowly, so the force per individual muscle fiber is high.
Yeah.
Whereas when we strength train, so basically with higher reps, this is why it's necessary to at least come close to failure within a couple of reps. Because those earlier reps when you're doing a sub-maximal load, those earlier reps are just not really contributing to the growth stimulus.
Gotcha.
What those earlier reps are in essence doing is they're bringing you to a point of fatigue to those last 5 or so reps, which are contributing to the stimulus. And it's those last 5 or so reps where now you have maximum motor unit recruitment and the bar's moving slowly, so you're getting a muscle building stimulus out of those. This is why it largely doesn't matter from a hypertrophy standpoint, whether we're doing 5 reps, 10 reps, 15, 20 reps. Those last 5 reps, as far as velocity, kinetics, and motor unit recruitment, look quite similar.
Yeah.
It's just, you could make the argument that low reps are more efficient for building muscle. And this is why I was saying earlier that, the optimal muscle building program is not that different from the optimal strength program, is because when you're doing sets of 5, 6 reps, you're pretty much getting muscle building value out of every rep, because the weight is heavy enough right from the beginning where motor unit recruitment is maxed out. Because motor unit recruitment, when you're using loads above 80, 85% of 1 RM, you're getting maxed out motor unit recruitment right from the get-go.
Yeah.
Because the resistance is quite high, you need to apply a high level of effort right from the beginning to overcome that resistance.
Yeah.
So when we're lifting heavy weights, you can argue that every rep you're getting muscle building value out of it. Now, when we're doing, for example, 10 reps though, we're doing 5 reps to fatigue to the point of those last 5 reps where we're getting a stimulus from. If you're doing 15 reps, you're now taking 10 reps to bring it to a point of fatigue where you're getting the muscle building value out of those last 5 reps. And if you're doing 20 reps, it's even less efficient. You're now spending 15 reps just to fatigue you to get you to the point of those last 5 reps. So it's not that it doesn't work. It does. Obviously, people have increased hypertrophy using reps of 5, 10, 15, 20, even more reps, but it's just not very efficient. If you're taking 15 reps to get to the point of those last 5 reps, really 3/4 of the time, you're doing work that's really not contributing directly to the muscle building stimulus.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, those earlier reps, while they don't contribute to the stimulus, they do contribute to fatigue.
Yes.
Okay. When you release metabolites into the cells, when you release calcium ions, those things actually increase both peripheral fatigue, so within the session, which hampers both acute central fatigue within the session, which basically hampers motor unit recruitment. So that's why if you look at it, for example, take a set of squats. If you're doing sets of 5, you can easily bang out 10 sets, no problem, right?
Yeah.
And you'll get 10 quality sets or stimuli of muscle building value. How many sets realistically of 20 reps can you hammer out before you're like on the floor, like puking, right?
Barely.
And that's the issue with doing too many reps, and all the drop sets and all those crazy techniques people love and associate with being really hardcore and like thinking that you're getting a better muscle building value out of those techniques. They carry a lot of fatigue, and the total amount of work that you're able to perform, even just within the sessions, much less. Realistically, if you went to close to failure with squats with 20 reps, you're lucky to get 2-3 sets and you'd be
Yeah.
done. Whereas if you're doing sets of 5, you'd get 10, 12, 15 sets probably, and you'd be okay because
Yeah.
those lower reps carry much less fatigue. So acutely within the session, doing too many reps because of the buildup of metabolites and the buildup of calcium ions and even the cardiovascular response, acute, like an increase in cardiovascular response does trigger acute central fatigue. So those three things, metabolites, muscle damage, cardiovascular response, that triggers central fatigue. So even within the workout, you'll find, especially towards the later end of the workout, you've accumulated more central fatigue. If central fatigue is present, right? So central fatigue is the ability of the nervous system to engage or activate the motor units. If central fatigue is present, you're not able to, activate those highest threshold motor units.
Yeah.
If you're not able to activate those motor units, you're not able to deliver a training stimulus to them. You're not able to impose a mechanical loading stimulus on those muscle fibers.
Yeah.
And that's what happens if you gas yourself too much within the workout, especially early on. Those later sets in the workout really turn into, what we call junk volume, is because at that point you're not stimulating much. There's such high level of fatigue that
Yeah.
the high threshold motor recruitment is hampered. So you're at best extending some of that stimulus or stimuli on the lower threshold motor units, on the intermediates, but not so much on the high threshold motor units. So from that standpoint, doing the low reps is much more efficient. Not to mention having a buildup of metabolites, calcium ions, that also causes muscle damage.
Yeah.
And then muscle damage tends to cause prolonged central fatigue, and
Gotcha.
also tends to cause prolonged peripheral fatigue. So central fatigue, as we said, is basically when the nervous system is basically not sending out the signal or innervating properly the muscles. Peripheral fatigue refers to basically what's happening at the neuromuscular junction when the muscle is receiving the signal. Well, basically the nervous system is sending out the signal, but because of like excitation, contraction, coupling failure, it's still failing to activate the muscle. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's still failing to impose a mechanical building stimulus on those fibers. So we have peripheral fatigue, and muscle damage increases both peripheral and central fatigue. So muscle damage releases there's like inflammatory cytokines,
Hmm.
and those inflammatory cytokines actually penetrate the brain and then cause central fatigue. And the funny thing is, it's not a localized phenomenon; it's actually a systemic phenomenon, meaning that it doesn't matter if you train your upper body today. If you release these inflammatory cytokines, they penetrate the brain. That causes central fatigue that affects the whole body. So it doesn't matter if you're training legs the next day, you will still have, if you induce a lot of muscle damage from the workout, you will have high levels like central fatigue present. And in a way, if you think about it, that's actually quite smart. What the
Yeah.
body's doing is, if it senses there's muscle damage or there's damaged tissue, it wants to basically put a hold on you causing further damage until it's able to repair the damaged tissue. And
Yeah.
the way it does that is by limiting or inhibiting high threshold motor recruitment. So as long as you have muscle damage there present, as long as you have central fatigue present, working that muscle group again within that time is basically redundant.
Yeah.
you know so that's why, again, if you induce too much muscle damage, or if you induce too much fatigue within the workout, you both acutely impact how much work you can do within that session, and you're increasing muscle damage, which is then impacting how often you can train that muscle group. So it's not that it doesn't work, but
Yeah.
you can argue that it's not optimal, because if you're doing too many reps, if you're inducing too much fatigue, you're not getting optimal muscle building stimulus within the workout, and then you're not recovering as quick because
Yeah.
you're accumulating high fatigue to stimulus. And that's not what we want. We want to
Yeah.
get high stimulus to fatigue ratio. So we want to look at what are ways we can maximize mechanical tension while minimizing fatigue.
Can you clarify for our students what the difference are between the three mechanisms, which is right mechanical tension, metabolic, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. What are the key differences between the three? Because I know sometimes people get those confused. And how do they contribute to hypertrophy?
So the only real stimulus for hypertrophy is mechanical tension.
Yep.
Period. There's no metabolic. Also, yeah, metabolite buildup or metabolic fatigue and muscle damage tend to be indirect byproducts.
Gotcha.
Um, and here's look up until there was a paper that Brad Schoenfeld published, a good paper about 10 years ago called The Three Mechanisms of Hypertrophy. It's probably one of the most well-read, well-researched paper. We've previously now, its certifications quoted that paper and used it as a basis for, formulating our methods.
Yep.
But more recent, at the time that we were going off the best available research we had, right? And since then, especially in the last, I'd say 3, 4, even 5 years now, since maybe 2017, 2018, there's been more good research coming out that's been able to tease out these mechanisms, muscle damage from mechanical tension and metabolite buildup from mechanical tension. And it's more and more the research is starting to show that muscle damage and metabolite buildup are just indirect byproducts of muscular contraction
Yeah.
and mechanical tension. They do not directly contribute towards muscle growth. So the only thing that causes stimulus for hypertrophy is mechanical tension. So that mechanical tension, which is experienced by the muscle fibers, is translated to a chemical signal that's called mechanotransduction, and that initiates a cascade which then triggers protein synthesis and muscle growth. That is the direct trigger for muscle growth. Now, the reason we previously thought muscle damage, for example, was an important stimuli in hypertrophy is because if you look at the methods which produce the most hypertrophy, they also produce the most muscle damage.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you look at eccentric, like super maximal eccentric training,
Yeah.
that has a very high level of muscle damage. It's also associated with more muscle growth and increase in strength. The other method is loaded stretching. If you look at loaded stretching, actually to date, the greatest hypertrophy ever recorded in any study was a study that used loaded stretching. It was an animal study by Dr. Jose Antonio. He tied like a weight to a bird's wing and he had it just holding it there. So it's literally just loaded stretch.
What?
And I think that study was done could have been as far back as 2009 now, even earlier. Could have been 2003, if I'm not mistaken.
That's
And basically what they found was the bird had a 309% increase or something like that in cross-sectional area within 1 month. The largest ever record. And they also suspected the hyperplasia because of the extreme muscle damage and fiber splitting, the hyperplasia took place. So because of those earlier studies, that's why we believe muscle damage. The other thing that with muscle damage too is when you do a workout that has higher level of muscle damage, there's higher level of satellite cell activation.
Yeah.
The satellite cells are little dormant cells that lie outside the muscle fiber. And basically what the satellite cells do is they fuse within the muscle fiber and they donate their nuclei and they help basically with initiating growth and repair process. Okay. So activation of satellite cell is one of the things that was seen as critical for, initiating the growth cascade and growth process. So you observe higher level of satellite cell activation with workouts that cause more muscle damage. And there was also high level of protein synthesis following workouts that induce muscle damage versus not. So that early on led us to believe that muscle damage was a key component in building muscle. And we thought, well, it makes sense. You damage the tissue then responds by growing and, increasing its capacity to resist damage. However, more recently, there has been a handful of studies that have been able to tease that out. And largely what they have found is repairing damaged tissue and synthesizing new tissue are two completely separate processes. So a lot of that increase in satellite cell activity and protein synthesis that we see after a workout that induces high level of muscle damage, that's to repair the damaged tissue, not to synthesize new tissue.
Yeah.
And if you're spending or sending all your resources to repair damaged tissue, how much resource have you got left to repair or to actually synthesize or grow new tissue? Especially given that the window for muscle protein synthesis is so small, 36 to 48 hours, muscle protein synthesis is back down to baseline.
Yeah.
And if you're still repairing damaged tissue in that 36 to 48 hours, you've literally had no resources going towards synthesizing new tissue. Because as we said, it's the priority to the body is to repair the damaged tissue first.
Yeah.
And you can also look at, for example, long distance running.
Yeah.
Long distance running induces high level of muscle damage.
Yeah.
It doesn't induce hypertrophy. Everyone knows, long distance running won't make you jacked.
Yeah.
So muscle damage, the reason those methods like loaded stretching and eccentric training were associated with the most hypertrophy is because they're also associated with the highest level of mechanical tension.
Yeah.
When you do a maximal eccentric, and we're talking about maximal eccentric contraction here, in other words, lowering weights that are heavier than your 1RM, heavier than what you can lift. That's a super maximal load. Obviously, that's going to be associated with higher mechanical tension.
Yeah.
But it just, as a side effect, you also get a high level of muscle damage.
Yeah.
Same thing with loaded stretching. When you stretch a muscle under load, you generate because you generate both active and passive tension.
Yeah.
The combined tension that you generate is very high. So passive tension occurs when we stretch a muscle. Basically, there's two ways we can compress the mechanoreceptors in the muscle cells. So when we contract the muscle, right, you contract it basically expands and it compresses the mechanoreceptors, so it bulges outwards. So they deforms and compresses those mechanoreceptors in a certain way.
Yeah.
That's called active tension. Then you have passive tension, which is when you stretch the muscle. When you stretch the muscle now, you actually pull on the mechanoreceptors, a different type of mechanical tension that's being experienced by those muscle fibers. And basically, when we're doing loaded stretching, anytime you stretch under load, you're getting both types of tension. Even though the active tension when you're fully stretched is not as high as when you say in the mid or peak contraction,
Yeah.
the combined tension that you get from when the muscle's fully lengthened under load is still higher than any other. So because of that, loaded stretching is associated with a very high level of mechanical tension as well, and that's why it's a very good stimulus for muscle growth. But having said that, if you go back to that concept of stimulus to fatigue, some methods carry a high level of stimulus and a high level of fatigue. So you could put loaded stretching and maximal eccentrics in that category.
Yeah.
Some methods carry high fatigue with very little extra stimulus.
Yeah.
Okay. So, for example, slow tempo training, doing lots of reps, short rest periods. All those methods do is jack up fatigue without really doing anything for the stimulus. So all they do is really increase the fatigue to stimulus ratio.
Yeah.
But that's the methods people tend to gravitate more towards, drop sets, supersets, feeling like the burn and all that, because they associate that with being more hardcore and muscle growth. And also we did used to think metabolites was a key component, which I'll get to in a second. But all those methods really do is just increase the amount of fatigue and don't do anything extra for this. They don't increase mechanical tension. In some
Yeah.
cases, they even lower mechanical tension. So the methods that we want to be turning to most of the time, because maximal eccentrics, loaded stretching is quite intense, there is a place for them in the routine, but you probably want to use them sparingly.
Yeah.
Most of the time, we want to be using methods that have a good stimulus but low fatigue, like a modest to high stimulus, but low level. And that's what I was saying earlier. When we're training with like reps of 5 to 8, sort of what we call that functional hypertrophy range, is kind of where we're getting that best of both worlds. We're getting a high level of stimulus and minimizing fatigue. Now, it's not as low. That's why I said close to, because it's not like pure strength training where we're going to be doing rep sets of 5 or less.
Yeah.
It's not that you can't grow with sets of 5 or less. You can, but you just need to do more volume, more total sets to get the volume. So it becomes less practical.
Yeah.
You'd need to do, if you're only getting 2-3 stimulating reps per set, you'd need to do 10-12 sets, whereas you could do this, get 3 sets, 3 to 5 sets, get the same stimulus from doing a bit more reps. So just not as time efficient, but it's still relatively on the, I guess, grand scheme of things, 5 to 8 reps is not really that high reps. It's still relatively low reps, and you're sort of hitting that minimal threshold of about 5 or so reps where you're getting enough volume and, you're getting maximizing mechanical tension quite early on so that you're not spending a whole lot of reps incurring a lot of excess fatigue.
Yeah, and you mentioned volume, and I wanted to touch on, when it comes to program design for hypertrophy, what would be a sweet spot for training volume? And I know it's going to be different depending on what muscles you're trying to grow, what the goal is, but rule of thumb for program design, what is a sweet spot for volume for each body part?
Can I circle back to that in like 2 seconds?
Yes.
I just want to answer the question before I lost my trail of thought because, we're talking about muscle damage and metabolic stress.
Yes.
So the reason then metabolic stress we've now been able to tease out doesn't contribute to hypertrophy is because the early studies that triggered the interest in metabolic stress as basically a stimulus for hypertrophy was the occlusion studies. Are you familiar with those ones?
I feel like I've read those before, but can you remind me?
They came out in like, I'd say 2008, 2009 out of Japan. They were the early studies on occlusion or blood flow restriction.
Oh,
And
BFR. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
and they came out back in like, 2008, 2009 for the first time I remember trying it. And they showed that you can, at that point, we heavily believed that you needed to lift relatively heavy loads, 70 to 85% of 1 RM to induce hypertrophy. So that was sort of what paved the way for us to see that you could actually hypertrophy with loads a lot lower than that. But they used a blood flow restriction, and basically what they found through that is the buildup of metabolites was insane. And that was attributed to, or some authors at least, not all of them, but some authors attributed the buildup of metabolites and the subsequent increase in like growth factors to as the trigger for muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Now, since then, we've had again more studies being done that basically found that if you apply occlusion after the workout, you do not experience that same level of hypertrophy as if you're applying. So the way it's traditionally done is you apply the blood pressure cuff, and then you keep it on while you're doing the set, and then you keep it on in between sets, right?
Mm-hmm.
What they found is if you actually put it on between, if you didn't keep it on, but then you put on between sets. So if you did a set without it, and you put the cuff on without when you're resting, or if you put the cuff on at the end of the workout, you still get that buildup of metabolites, but you don't get this increase in hypertrophy. In fact, it actually had a detrimental effect on hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So in essence, what they were doing is they were teasing out that what happened is that just the increase in those metabolites when you remove them from the mechanical tension, and basically they found no effect. And the reason I think that, and what some authors have speculated with regard to blood flow restriction, why it actually still works, because it does,
Yeah.
is because normally the lowest threshold of weight for inducing hypertrophy is probably around 40% of 1 RM.
Yeah.
When you start going below 40% of 1 RM, even if you go to the point of failure, by that point, you've just built up so much fatigue that it's unlikely you're recruiting those highest threshold motor units. Because
Yeah.
remember, we said if you build up too much metabolites and too much cardiovascular fatigue, and you release too many calcium ions, you will start to induce central fatigue. So if you're doing that many reps, there is a point of diminishing returns where you're no longer, even if you go to complete failure, getting that same stimulus. So when you take the blood occlusion, though, we can use loads as low as 30% and still get growth, right? But here's what happens. When we apply that blood pressure cuff, we basically cut off oxygen supply to the muscle, right?
Yeah.
That's while we're doing the set. Now, without oxygen, those oxidative fibers, the slow twitch fibers, crap out right out of the bat.
Yeah.
And what happens is you're left recruiting those highest threshold motor units quite early on, before excessive amount of fatigue. And then you'll notice too, is if you're using 30% of 1 RM, normally you'd be getting 40 plus reps with that.
Yeah.
Whereas you'll notice if you're using occlusion training, you probably gas out, if you're lucky at 30 reps the first set, and on subsequent sets, you'd be lucky to even get 15 reps.
Yeah.
You gas out really quickly. And that again happens because those oxidative fibers without oxygen, they crap out quickly, and then we're left recruiting the high threshold motor units quite early on, even with light loads. That's what makes blood flow restriction an effective modality for allowing us to hypertrophy with lighter loads. And it's a good modality for that because let's say you're injured, or you just don't have access, like during the COVID lockdowns, you don't have access to heavy weights. It's a good way to help still hypertrophy with lighter loads.
Yeah.
But it's not because of the metabolites. It's because you're just able to recruit the high threshold motor units
Yeah.
because the slow twitch fibers crap out. And there was a few authors, even as far back as 2009, that proposed that theory, that instead of the metabolites, it was the slow twitch fibers crap out. And I think
Yeah.
now that's more likely looking like that's the case. So that's why that's the argument against metabolites. That again, you don't. The metabolites are just a byproduct of contraction, of doing a lots of reps.
Yeah.
Short rest periods also tend to cause buildup of these metabolites. So it's not really a direct trigger of hypertrophy. It's just a side effect, and it can actually, to a point, become detrimental to hypertrophy as well. So it's not something we should, muscle damage and I guess metabolite buildup is not something we should purposefully go and seek out
Yeah.
for
No.
when we're trying to build muscle.
Yeah. And I think when it comes, one note on the BFR training, I think it really just, it depends as a coach if you are going to be prescribing it. There's a time and place, like you said, for an injury. When I tore my meniscus, that was actually a method that my PT used with me to help me rebuild my strength in my quad. But you see a lot of gen pop going into these methods and tools and just using it mindlessly. And I think sometimes that could be inappropriate in the sense of like it's causing more harm than good. So when it comes to that, I think it's really important just to note for our coaches, it's, you want to make sure if you are going to be recommending those things, they are appropriate for your client and their needs. You don't need
That's right.
to
So
huff
in
yourself entirely for every workout you do to optimize hypertrophy.
and that's the thing. People think that a lot of people, that's just their what associate with. And I guess it comes down from being passed on from generations of like the hardcore
Yeah.
lifters, and a lot of that gets propagated by like elite bodybuilders. Like you look at Arnold, for example. In his interviews with the inspirational music, leave nothing in the tank. I always went to balls to wall every set. All
Yeah.
that heroism like going on. But if you read Arnold's first ever book, it's The Education of a Bodybuilder. Have you
Yes.
ever read that one?
I actually have it upstairs in my library.
You've read that one?
Yeah, my stepdad is a big bodybuilding fan, and he has like all these like old school physiology books. So I dusted that off, and I was like, "What is this?" So yeah, I did get a chance to look at that.
So for anyone that hasn't read that one, a lot of people have read the Encyclopedia. That's his newer book, but I think that's a lot more adulterated because it was influenced by in that one, he was in the encyclopedia, he was basically preaching that you go to failure every set. In his first book, in the Education of a Bodybuilder, it's much more genuine. It's much more reflective of how he actually trained. It was his earlier book before he was massive,
Yeah,
and he basically said, I always use the add weight principle. So he goes, whenever I did any exercise, if I was going to do 5 sets and my working weight was 200 pounds, he goes, I would start with 100 pounds, and I was doing, let's say, 6 to 8 reps. I'll do 100 pounds for 8 reps, 120, 140, 160, 180. And then my last set is where I would push hard and go too close to failure.
yeah,
So out of 5 sets, really, it was only one working set that
yeah,
he was getting. So yeah, Arnold did a lot of volume, and you can argue that he did, 5 exercises per body part, 5 sets, 25 sets of like chest, but he was only really taking one of those sets to failure. So his actual volume wasn't that great. He wasn't that different than say Dorian Yates, who calls himself an advocate of low volume training. He did a very similar thing. He would do
yeah,
3-4 exercises per muscle group, but he would really ramp up the weight to one hard all out working set and beyond. And
yeah,
then he just didn't count those warm up sets as working sets. But
yeah,
the volume, as far as the number of stimulating reps, is actually probably not all that different, even though one's a high volume output. In the traditional sense of volume, Arnold's using higher volume versus Dorian Yates. But this is why, coming back to your question, is how do we define volume? I guess that's the most important thing, because traditionally, volume is defined as the sets times the reps, the total amount of work you perform. And the volume load is your sets times the reps times the weights, which includes also how much weight you're lifting. But what that really is related to is the absolute work.
yeah,
And what we're finding is the absolute work has very little relevance for hypertrophy. And because, as we said, it's really only the last 5 reps or so in any given set that's contributing to the stimulus. So, for example, if we did 3 sets of 10 reps, the total volume as far as reps would be 30, right?
yeah,
If we did 3 sets of 30 reps, the total volume would be 90. We'd actually be getting much higher volume from 3 sets of 30 reps.
yeah,
The growth stimulus, though, probably the same. If anything, the 3 sets of 10 will probably be better because you're accumulating less fatigue. So by 3 sets of 30, by the third set, you probably might have quite a substantial fatigue built up. Or 3 sets of 5, you'd still be getting only 15 reps, but the stimulus is still the same. So if we define volume in the traditional sense, in regard to hypertrophy, it just doesn't have a lot of relevance. And the
Yeah.
reason is because, as we said, the muscle building stimulus is really coming out of those last few reps. You could argue those last 5 or so reps. So a
Yeah.
more practical way for hypertrophy to define training volume is really just to look at the number of working sets or the number of
Yes.
hard sets that are approaching failure. You could, if you wanted to be a little bit more technical, you could look at the number of stimulating reps.
Yeah.
Because, for example, and this is something I more or less do, let's say, based on literature, you could sort of argue that optimal number of stimulating reps is sort of between minimal will be around 15 reps, I'd say, but optimal probably around 25, and then maximal probably up around 35.
Yeah.
So let's take 25 reps as sort of that benchmark, 25 total stimulating reps. Now, if you look at historically, most of the rep schemes that have stood the test of time, like 5 sets of 5, 6 sets of 4, 4 sets of 6, eight
Yeah.
sets of 3, they all hover around that 25 total reps. And they
Yeah.
were historically always known to induce both very good level of muscle growth and hypertrophy, because
Yeah.
you're getting a good amount of volume and you're lifting relatively heavy weight. And as we said, when we're doing heavy weights, typically less than 5 reps or less, every rep is a stimulating rep. So in all those rep schemes, we're getting around that 25 stimulating reps. But, if we wanted to look at it as far as how does that translate to doing 10 reps, 15 reps, so forth? Well, let's say any one set, if you took to absolute failure, you would literally get, let's say, 5 stimulating reps. We could argue that you get about, whether you're doing 10 reps, 15 reps, 20 reps, you could make the argument that you're getting around 5 or so out of those reps are contributing to the growth stimulus. So we'll call those 5 stimulating reps or 5 effective reps, whatever you want to call them. So that's if we train to absolute failure. So if we train to absolute failure, to get 25 total stimulating reps, you probably need 5 hard sets and you're done. Right?
Yeah.
Now, if you were, let's say, leaving 1 rep in the tank, you've then now, because you're only getting 4 stimulating reps per set, you'd need to do 6 sets to get that 25 stimulating reps. If you were leaving 2 reps in the tank, now you're only getting 3 stimulating reps per set. You'd need to do about 8 sets to get your 25 reps, right? If you're leaving 3 reps in the tank, now we're only getting 2 stimulating reps per set. Now you have to do 12 sets to get the same. So you
Yeah.
have to find that balance between training in close proximity, probably neither, that's the sort of the extremes, up to 12 sets, leaving about 3 reps in the tank, or 5 sets per body part going to failure. That's sort of the extremes of volume. So
Yeah.
if you're going to failure, you want to be shooting for maybe 4 or 5 sets per muscle group, like a lot of the pros. That's how a lot of the pros train. Yes, they do a lot of sets, but most of those aren't even working sets. Most of those are ramping sets, priming them for their work sets. They may only do about 4 or 5 working sets in a workout. At the other end of the spectrum, if you're leaving 3 reps or so in the tank, you can get up to probably 12 or so sets per body part. The optimal is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Maybe leaving around 2 or so reps per set, and maybe aiming for around 8 to 10 sets per body part is probably ideal
Yeah.
as far as the volume for hypertrophy. Yeah.
I think that especially whether you're an athlete or a coach, it takes time for you to develop that knowledge on what that actually looks like with your training. I think for the beginning part of my training career, when I first started myself as an athlete, that was a hard thing for me. I never knew what it was like to actually train to failure, or at least what I thought was failure. And I think with training age or with experience, where if you've trained with a coach or actually gone to failure, you can gauge that where you're like pushing yourself to the point where you're getting very close but are not there entirely. So I think that is a big part that can be a learning block at the beginning, especially for beginning clients or beginning athletes who are diving into this stuff. It takes a little bit of practice to get into the groove of knowing that that was a working set and not just a warm up set. Because really, like you were talking about, it has to be quality reps and quality sets for them to actually quote unquote count, besides them just being junk volume or primers or warm ups or whatever else coaches call them. When it comes to one other thing I wanted to touch on, when it comes to training for hypertrophy, when for program design, when it comes for that to that rep range, and we were talking about fatigue. I know we were talking about, how we could trigger central nervous system fatigue when we are going really high with reps and lighter load. But for example, most people who probably are chasing hypertrophy goals are competitors. And I'm using this myself as an example, being about 2 weeks out. I'm straying away from lower rep ranges because I'm so fatigued that I physically don't want to injure myself pushing really crazy loads. What are your thoughts on programming, especially getting into those last few weeks of a show where you can't you can't have nutrition that's going to support recovery. You kind of have to crawl your way through your sessions. You're fatigued to begin with. What are your coaching and programming approaches for that specifically?
Look, it's a good question. Funnily enough, if you look at the literature, higher reps induce more fatigue than the lower reps. There was one study I think that compared 8 sets of 3 reps versus 8 sets of 8 to 12 reps, more
Yeah,
traditional bodybuilding style. And the 8 sets of 8 to 12 reps induced much higher level fatigue that took longer to recover from.
yeah,
Now, having said that, when you're working those lower rep ranges, five, so I wouldn't recommend going 5 or less for the most case anyway, when it's hypertrophy is the goal.
yeah,
But if you are working those lower rep ranges, there's a level of arousal that you need to get under that heavy weight, under that bar, right? And especially when you're at that later stages of your prep and you're already very fatigued and mentally drained, it's just hard to get yourself in that state of arousal to get under the heavy weight. Not to mention your joints are sore, because they've been pounded for the last how many weeks.
yeah,
You also, when you lose body fat, by default, you will lose in a lot of those big lifts like the squat, because your leverage decreases when you lose a bit of body fat. When you lose mass, period, you just lose some of that tension in the body and some leverage. So I found there were certain lifts when I used to compete that I always took out just because psychologically it would mess with me. Like bench press, my bench always went down, is because, as you lose weight around the lats, you lose some of that cushioning and support coming out of the bottom of the bench. So the bench would always drop. Squat as well as my midsection went down, my
yeah,
squat would drop off. So when I used to prep, I used to, switch most of my press into incline because I found my incline wasn't as affected.
yeah,
I will switch most of my squat into front squats, more machine squats, but also psychologically, sometimes it's easier to push through the workout just by switching to more isolation work.
yeah,
And I think, and I used to do that too. Look, don't get me wrong. When I was, especially the last few shows that I did as I started getting older, I did switch to more machine, more isolation work. It's just psychologically easier. Machines and isolation work, they're just not as mentally taxing.
yeah,
And it's, high isolation exercises generally can withstand greater levels of fatigue. They can withstand the higher reps a little bit more.
yeah,
So a thing you have to consider too when it comes to training and when it comes to program design, variation is very much for the mind
yeah,
much more than it is for the muscles. Because look, the only thing the muscles know is mechanical tension.
yeah,
How you get there, it doesn't give a shit.
yeah,
How you get there doesn't really care whether they're doing 5s, 10s, 15s, 20 reps, drop sets. As long as you impose a certain mechanical loading stimulus on the muscle fibers, they will respond. Now, given they will become more resistant to exercise-induced stress over time, and
yeah,
that's what I was going to actually come to this just before, is that's why your volume, it's a good idea to start probably on the least amount of volume initially that you can, because the
yeah,
tissue then becomes more and more resistant to exercise induced stress. You want to then increase the volume to account for that, increased resistance to the stress.
yeah,
So from a physiological standpoint, from the standpoint of the muscle cell, it only knows mechanical loading. And yes, over time, that mechanical loading must increase. So you continue imposing a mechanical loading stimulus. Um, but what happens is psychologically, it's the mind that drives the body, the muscles, right? It's a
Yeah.
nervous system that engages the muscles. And central drive, in other words, the drive from the motor cortex to the muscles, is largely driven by motivation.
Yeah.
And that's why there's a saying that when the mind goes, the body follows. When you get bored of a program, when you start dreading coming into the gym and you're just dragging your ass in there and you lose your motivation, you're going to have diminished central drive. When you have diminished central drive, you're not going to, adequately recruit those highest threshold motor units.
Yeah.
And this is why we do need variation in training for our psychology to keep it fresh, to keep it interesting, to keep us from burning out. Because if we did the exact sorry, same thing in the exact same way over and over and over, we would eventually burn out.
Yeah.
You know, and so when you get to that stage in a comp prep, for example, where you are drained, the most important thing is to get in there and get your stimulus. Do what you have to do to maintain that stimulus, to maintain the tissue. So if helping switching to higher reps, more machine work actually is easier for you psychologically to deal with in that moment,
Yeah.
then there's nothing wrong with that. That's a smart decision that you as a competitor, as a coach, may need to make to help you deal with the training load. And look, I feel that too. Like heavy weights, even though acutely heavy weights doesn't cause as much fatigue,
Yeah.
acutely doesn't. If we're constant lifting, and with like elite powerlifters, for example, have known this for years, that if you max out on a lift for about more than 3 weeks, you will hit a wall, right?
Yeah.
That's why the peaking phase in the powerlifters comp prep before they're peaking for a meet usually happens in the last 3 weeks or so.
Yeah.
And you're trying to peak for longer than on a lift, you will burn out. Now, there was one study, and what this has to do with is basically if you're always going to a state of over arousal, right? Because you do, to lift heavy ass weights, you need to be aroused, right? You need to get into
Yeah.
that state of arousal. Your dopamine levels, your norepinephrine, your adrenaline levels go through the roof. Now, if you're doing that too often, too regularly, you will desensitize your dopaminergic and your beta adrenergic receptors.
Yeah.
And there was one study, they looked at a group of subjects that maxed out on the squat for 2 weeks every day. They found after 2 weeks there was about a close to 40% down regulation in beta adrenergic receptors. So your adrenaline, noradrenaline, those stress hormones and excitatory chemicals on your neurotransmitters, they bind to beta adrenergic receptors. That's how they exert their effects. So when those receptors are downregulated, they're no longer binding properly to the receptor, and you're getting the effects of like what we call hypoadrenal function, like low energy, low motivation, um, and that's just basically the body trying to. This is called reactive inhibition, when the body tries to inhibit an action which causes fatigue. You know, so this is why we need that variation in our workouts, is because you will condition reactive inhibition after a while. And even with the heavy lifting, yes, acutely you might not be very fatigued after doing one workout with sets of 3. You might feel good, but do that enough times, too many weeks in a row, you will start to, because of always entering that state of arousal, you will start to desensitize those beta adrenergic receptors. You will start to lose your motivation and training drive. So for that reason, we need some variety in the training stimulus.
Can you talk to us really quickly about your thoughts and what the literature has to say about, and especially nowadays, with like recent years, past 3, 4 years, especially on social media, you have these hypertrophy coaches popping up left and right. And a lot of them talk down more so on compound lifts and how compound lifts are not ideal for hypertrophy, that, machine work and isolation work are more ideal for hypertrophy. What is the reality of that when it comes to exercise selection for hypertrophy?
Look, I think exercise selection is individual. I don't think there's a best for every muscle group. There's a best compound or isolation lift. I think it can vary from person to person. Um, and I think limiting yourself to just one or the other in itself is limiting. If, for example, um, take, and I think individual biomechanics will come into play here as well. So if you take someone like myself and you take the squat, because I have long femurs, for me, when I squat, my inclination is quite forward. I get just a lot of glutes. Like all squats does, it blows out my ass. I don't get a lot of quads. So for someone like me, with my structure, doing more hack squats, doing more leg extensions, CC
The quads.
squats is actually better for developing my quads, right? But that's more of a mechanical thing. For someone with shorter legs, longer torso, that can stay relatively upright and drop into a deep squat, they will get a phenomenal muscle building. They can literally develop their legs with just squats.
Yeah,
So it's overly simplistic to say, oh, you shouldn't just do compound or isolation. It really depends on the muscle group and on your structure. But as a rule of thumb, whenever you have a muscle group which is harder to build, more isolation work for that muscle will generally tend to do the job better. Reason being is because the body seeks the path of least resistance. Okay, so it
yeah,
seeks to recruit the muscle that's best suited to getting the job done. So, like I said, in my case, when I'm squatting, because of my alignment and posture, my glutes are in a better mechanical leverage to generate torque than my quads. So
yeah,
squats blow my ass out. So I need to find ways to change my mechanics so I can target the quads more. So for me, for example, quads, especially that lower insertion point near the teardrop, I need a lot more isolation work to bring that area up.
yeah,
Um, Same thing because I've got very long arms. I've always need to do a lot of isolation work to build my arms, right? And reason being, when I'm doing close grip presses, chins, the body, because my arms are very long, they're inefficient levers. The body seeks the path of least resistance. So I recruit the proximal muscles very well, like my pecs,
yeah,
my lats. Never had problem growing my pecs or my lats. Like these days, I barely even train my chest at all. I
yeah,
don't train my glutes at all. But for my arms, because they're inefficient levers, I had to do a lot of isolation work to get them up to like 18 inches.
yeah,
I need to do a lot of isolation work. Contrast that with my training partner, good mate of mine. He had shorter arms. He would didn't even need to touch arms, and his arms were almost the same size as mine. But he had a
yeah,
hard time growing his chest.
yeah,
So he didn't need to do a lot of isolation on his arms, but he needed to do a lot of isolation on his chest because when he was pressing, his delts and his triceps were taking over. He had a harder time growing the chest, so he needed to do more isolation on the chest. So you have to sort of look at the individual. Where are their weaknesses? What's their structure like? And when you look at the compound lift, sometimes the compound lift, it's true, it's not the best job to target a
yeah.
certain muscle group, and you may need more isolation. But sometimes the compound lift will do the job just fine.
Yeah, I also think that with compound lifts too, as they are compound movements, they aren't obviously ideal for isolation and require a lot of technique. So, like a beginner would probably have to go through like that learning curve of learning how to properly squat, deadlift, bench press. Whereas you put them onto a machine where it's already more stable, it allows them to go through that, bypass that learning curve of doing it with proper form so that they are stable and there's not different directions of force, right? You're either moving vertically, horizontally, whatever it may be. So I think it goes back to what you said about making sure you're tailoring the programming to the specific client, the athlete, what they need to improve on, and looking at how they train. How are they
Look,
performing these things can also help you with
I
that.
will say this:
Yeah,
there is no good data to suggest compound movements or free weights in that matter are better than machines.
yeah.
There's even performance studies that showed there's some study shows Smith machine squat outperform barbell back squat for vertical jump. You know what I
Wow.
mean? So
Yeah,
there's no one of the myths out there that is circulating is that free weights are superior to machines. And if you go dig up the literature on that,
yeah,
there's very little, if any, to substantiate that claim.
yeah,
Having said that, one of the reasons I do prefer free weights over machines is machines lock you into a fixed path.
yeah,
And because especially like Smith machine, something that like really fixed, rigid path, and that can more easily develop. You can develop repetitive injury strain from being locked into a fixed path rather than being in a more natural groove that the free weight affords. So
yeah,
for that reason, I still, for the most part, tend to prefer free weights.
yeah,
But like I said, there's very weak evidence to suggest that free weights are better than machines, or
yeah,
that compound movements for hypertrophy is better than isolation movements.
yeah.
But for
And
some people, like I said, if you can get more bang for buck,
yeah,
you know, from the compound movement, then why omit the compound movement? Not to
Exactly.
mention the compound movement allows you to train in lower rep ranges, and as we said, those lower rep ranges are less fatiguing. I would never do sets of like 5 or 8 reps on leg extension. I
Yeah.
remember I was doing with the stack at our gym was around 315 pounds, and I was doing that for 15 reps on the leg extension.
Yeah.
you know, and yeah, I could do one leg at a time, probably to do less reps than that. But what that's going to like tear my knee off. So it just
Yeah.
wasn't practical. Like tricep extensions, I never go anything less than 10, 12 reps on extensions because again, just beats my elbows up too much.
Yeah.
So whenever you want, when working the lower rep range, especially as you get stronger, then compound movements are just much more ergonomical and much more suited for working those lower rep ranges as well. So because of that, I just wouldn't write off the compound lifts.
Yeah. I think training morale overall is really important for your athletes and clients. And as a coach,
Super,
you have to
super
understand.
important. Very, very underlooked. It is
Yeah.
really important because the thing is, if you keep the most important thing is, irrespective of what you're doing, is if you keep showing up and you keep basically inducing overload, like you're putting more weight on the bar, or you're doing more reps for the same,
Yeah.
um, with the same weight, you're going to grow.
Yeah.
And one of the things, actually, one of my personal theories around hypertrophy is this: the method that gets you strongest the fastest for reps, because you can get stronger for doubles or singles, even triples, without getting appreciable gains in size, because that's mostly going to be neurological and tendon adaptation. But if you're getting stronger for 5, 6 reps or more, whatever method gets you the strongest the quickest will yield the most hypertrophy.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways what's the most optimal method for you. And a funny thing is, like with me, for example, I always found through experience, take certain muscle groups like biceps, back, I always found using looser form, on my curls, on my rows, I just got way stronger, way faster. And I've been criticized on social media and YouTube for some of my videos that, you're not lifting with perfect form, you're not squeezing the muscle, you're not pausing. But here's the thing, like, I used to do bent over barbell rows, really strict, come up, pause for 2 seconds, come back down under control. And I was struggling with, probably the most was like 180 pounds, right? Now, and then I look at Ronnie Coleman, Arnold, Dorian Yates, those mass monsters, and I see them like throwing the weight around, ripping it up explosively. Like, in his book, Arnie says, when you're doing the T-bar row, make sure you're very strict, squeeze the muscle at the top, don't bounce the weight. And then you look at him in fucking pumping iron, like an animal, bouncing it off, ripping it up. So say one thing, do another, And I noticed all these, like I'm sitting there squeezing the weight, killing myself, and these mass monsters just ripping the weight up. So I started just experimentally seeing how that works if I started using a little bit looser form. So I started doing that on barbell row. All of a sudden, I'm up to, from 180, 200 pounds, 225, 250, 275, 300, 315. I got up to about 350 pounds on barbell rows, heavy, semi-loose form. Okay, yeah, semi-loose form. But then I could go back to strict. My back blew out. It got the thickest it's ever gotten. My back's always been one of the best body parts on stage. So my back got really thick doing that. And then when I go to strict form, I could do 225, even 250 and squeeze it and get up there. So even for strict form, I got way stronger by doing the loose forms. So for me, that worked really well. It got me really strong and got packed on a lot of size from doing that. Now there's actually, and I said I got criticized for this, but it's funny, the guys criticizing me, usually guys that don't even sport 15-inch arms. And I've been training longer than they've been alive. Most of these guys that are criticizing me, it's funny to me that they don't think that I've tried everything you could possibly try, and I've come to this conclusion through just experimentation. And as a lot of the biggest guys have, a lot of these guys intuitively find that sometimes using looser form can be better than being too strict, especially on certain exercises. Certain exercises lend themselves better to being slightly less strict. Particularly, like there was one study that looked at dumbbell lateral raise and compared using 10 kilograms in really strict form in increments of 12 and a half, 15, 17 and a half, 20 kilograms using progressively looser form, obviously progressively more and more momentum with the heavier weights. Guess at which weight they found had the greatest peak and mean torque. If
Which
10 kilo, yeah, so if 10 kilos represented you doing the lateral raise in super strict form, guess up to 20 kilos using progressively looser form. Guess at what point they got the best mean and peak torque. Have a
are you
guess.
asking me? Sorry, the
Yeah.
dogs are barking really, really loud upstairs.
Okay. Did you catch that last part?
No, I didn't.
No, so I was just saying, have a guess. If so, they did this study. They had participants do 10 kilogram lat raise. This was a stimulated study, actually, up to 20 kilograms, using incrementally more momentum as the weight got heavier. So they went 10, 12 and a half, 15, 17 and a half, 20 kilos. Guess at what weight they found the highest peak and mean torque?
The lighter one.
No, it was actually 15 kilos.
Oh, how
So
come?
that's a substantial amount of momentum. Well, because think of it this way: when you do, for example, lateral raise, or same thing with a barbell row, with those movements, the most amount of torque is right at the shortened position, right at the top.
Yeah,
Now, at the top of in the peak contraction, the muscle fibers are too bundled up. Where there's actin and myosin, there's points at which myosin is no longer able to bind. There's no binding sites.
yeah,
So when the muscles is too shortened, you actually lose some torque. You lose the capacity to generate force. Just like when the muscle's too lengthened, there's less actin and myosin bridges
yeah,
that are forming. So that's why at the extreme range of motion, at least actively, the muscle's not able to generate as much force. Now, if you're pausing here, squeezing the weight on a barbell row or lateral raise at the top of the movement, where you're actually weakest and you're generating less torque, you are then grossly understimulating the bottom position where the muscle is able to generate much greater torque. The muscle actively generates the most torque when it's semi-lengthened. So not fully lengthened, but semi-lengthened. That's when you have the optimal binding between actin and myosin to generate peak torque. The combined tension, because also when you fully stretch the muscle, as we said, you get more passive tension as well as active tension. So the most combined tension is still when the muscle is fully lengthened. But as far as at least active tension, it's when the muscle is semi-lengthened. That's when we generate the most active tension. So if you're trying to pause at the top, or you're trying to be too strict, you're limiting what you can lift in your strongest position because you're limited by that very light load. Now, if you start using looser form, yes, you're going to create momentum in the beginning of the movement. But if you think about lat raise, bent over row, seated cable row, upright row, those movements naturally get harder towards the top of the movement anyway. So even if you have, created some momentum, you're still working hard at the top of the movement because it's just naturally much harder there anyway. So even with momentum, you're still working hard. So that's why some movements just lend themselves better to being a little bit looser, because if you're too strict, you're just really under stimulating your strongest position.
yeah, gotcha.
And it's one of those things. And I found, those movements are just get much stronger, much quicker. And that's a good guideline to follow. Whatever method gets you strongest the quickest for reps is generally going to be the method that's going to produce the most growth.
Yeah.
As well, 4 reps.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the things I think we're talked a lot about like program design for hypertrophy, but I think one of the things that we got a lot of questions about, and I think is important to touch on, is nutrition for hypertrophy. So, what are some key takeaways for optimizing nutrition for hypertrophy, especially when it comes to like protein synthesis and protein timing?
Um. So there was a fairly new, up until the last couple of years, the general consensus by most of those in the evidence-based community has been that you don't need more than 1.6 grams of protein to maximize the anabolic response. To be honest, I quite never was on board with that. Like, what to me, that's that's one fucking meal, 1.6 grams of protein. That's breakfast. But I never quite got on board with that. Even so, that was from a meta-analysis done a couple of years ago, I think around 2017 or 16. And even so, even that meta-analysis, they actually found the 95% confidence interval was up to about 2.2. So even that did not encompass like people that are citing that study is not accounting for like that upper confidence interval. And the other thing was that was done in basically hyper or eucaloric conditions, so eating at maintenance or above, right? Now, there was a more recent meta-analysis, but even at that point, I knew from some of the other studies that I had seen that, especially studies where they took participants in a deficit, they had gone as high as 3 grams per kilo and basically seen much more favorable retention of muscle, even building, in some cases, building muscle while being in a deficit, from going as high as 3 grams of protein, even 3.5. So a more recent meta-analysis, this was done, actually, it was either a 221 or 222. I read the paper this year, a couple of months ago. So whether it came out earlier this year or at the end of last year, I can't quite remember. But they had 3 times as many studies as the initial paper by Schoenfeld et al. And they also included studies of inner deficit. And they did found, like, obviously exponential increase in protein intake and anabolic response up to around 1.5 grams or so, quite consistent with the earlier meta-analysis. But even so, even after that, even though there was initial very large dose response effect, it still continued to increase at a much lower rate after that 1.5 grams, up until about 3.5 grams.
Yeah.
So you do tend to see an increase in anabolic response going above that, but it's much more modest compared to the initial increase. So at the very least, you probably want to be targeting that 1.6 grams.
Yeah.
But I can tell you, I barely have, outside of clients that I have that have like gout or kidney issues or stuff like that, I rarely have any client that low. Most clients are sitting around 2.5 up to 3 grams
Yeah. I
mostly.
yeah, and I
And
think
especially when you're
especially,
in a,
yeah, I was just gonna say what you were about to say, especially when you're in a deficit. I think having a higher protein intake, not only for satiety, but preserving muscle mass and helping you, with calorie expenditure, having protein be, it's not by going to be a big factor, but being the highest TEF, I think, you can only benefit from increasing your protein intake, especially during a deficit.
you can, and then it also tends to be more satiating as well.
Yeah.
And that's always a plus. And I do tend to lower clients' protein intake during a maintenance or surplus phase, just for
Yes.
the fact that it's easier to put the food down because, easier to put the food down. Then when they go into a dieting phase, it just feels easier that they're not dieting as much because when you increase the thermic foods like, fiber, vegetables, protein, it feels like the volume of food as well is not decreasing. Now, having said that, I am unbiased towards high or low protein. To be honest, I have to look at just the evidence and for what it is. And there is also a darker side or downside to higher protein intake that is only more coming to light in the last few years. Um, so, often you'll hear people say high protein intake is not detrimental to the kidneys. There's no data to substantiate that in people with healthy kidney function. Well, most of the people saying that was from a study done in 2004. There was a couple more recent papers that came out in the last couple of years that show even in healthy populations, like high protein intake can exacerbate kidney function. And the other thing that's more recently come to light too is with regard to protein intake and dietary acidic load. So up until recently, it was believed that the food that we ate didn't have much impact on the basically the acidity in our body, right? And that's because the body very tightly regulates that acid alkaline balance. Um, so yeah, for the most part, you're right. If you look at someone's blood work or urine, if someone's urine or blood is acidic, they're at that point they're at a very critical level. So the body will fight very hard to maintain the blood pH within a certain level. However, there's more sensitive tests in the last couple of years have found that there's certain buffering systems that help buffer our blood and the body, the bicarbonate system being the dominant one. And there's certain blood markers now that can reveal if someone has low grade metabolic acidosis. If their buffering systems are being overwhelmed, because there's only so much acid that the body can clear out per day. And the average high protein diet tends to exceed that amount. And over time, especially if you're not consuming adequate amount of vegetables, fruits, and then there's certain minerals like potassium, magnesium that are alkalizing, you can increase the acidic load on the body. and that can lead to insulin resistance, inflammation, even like early onset of mortality, even depression, even joint pain. So there has been linked quite a few recent studies, probably half a dozen that I've just read in the last year or so, that have shown that high dietary acid load can become problematic. Um, and I've seen that too in clients. I've had a few of my mentoring students like bring forth case studies to me with like certain clients that had very hard time losing weight. They were on high protein diet, and they bicarbonate level was very low, indicating like low grade metabolic acidosis. So that's something too that we do need to be mindful of, like slamming too much protein, too high protein for too long. It's probably not ideal either, So that's probably another good reason, especially in a mass building phase, maybe to back off on the protein a little bit. If someone's bicarbonate levels are below optimal, because if you look at bicarbonate as a blood marker, the reference range is between 20 to 32. Now, this is the pathological range. The pathological range, right? The optimal range or the functional range where we want to be is between 28 to 32. And you'll see a lot of people, so if their blood work comes back and their bicarbonate is sitting at 22, 23, they'll look at it and think, oh, the doctor will look at it and say it's normal, there's nothing wrong, but it's actually not optimal. It already indicates there's low-grade metabolic acidosis that's present. So if someone has that, then I probably would back off on the protein a little bit, increase vegetable intake, increase certain intake of minerals like magnesium, potassium, because that can help. Now, having said that, a fully alkaline diet's probably not ideal either, because if you look at the literature, being too alkaline, so this is not an argument for going vegan or vegetarian, because going too alkaline can also actually increase the risk of mortality. And that's probably because by then abstaining from foods, because the foods that have the highest acidities, high protein foods, especially animal proteins, and then cheeses, things like that, tend to have a high dietary acid load, grains to some degree. But animal proteins tend to be the most. So if you go too low, then you also open up yourself to certain nutrient deficiencies by going too low on those.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, taking all of that into account, probably a moderate protein intake, not going too ape shit with it. I've probably been too trigger happy with protein that now in the last year or so that I have backed off on my protein intake.
Yeah.
I have made sure one of my weaknesses always with diet has been not eating enough vegetables. Like I eat a good amount of fruit, but making salads and stuff is probably an area where I could improve on with diet. I've been much more conscious this year to drink my green drinks, get enough veggies, continue having fruit, lower my protein a bit. Also, interestingly, it's more animal protein. So plant-based protein sources don't seem to be associated, even though you need a bit more to get the same anabolic effect because they're not as efficient as the animal-based proteins. They
This
don't
goes to
seem
the
to have.
question our student asked, does the type of protein matter? I think that you're touching it right on.
Yeah, 100%. It does seem to matter. So basically, from a muscle building standpoint, the quality of the protein comes down to the leucine content and the essential amino acids, right? Because it's the leucine that triggers muscle protein synthesis. And then the rest of the aminos act sort of as substrate, as building blocks. So I always compared, building muscle to building a house. So if you think of leucine like the architect, it's like the messenger that sends the signal to turn on protein synthesis. You have the other amino acids, the essential amino acids as the building blocks. They're like your bricks. And then you have insulin, which is like helps deposit or transport those amino acids into the cell. So insulin is like the bricklayers. You need those three things to build muscle.
Yeah.
So if we look at the quality of protein as far as muscle building, we're looking at its leucine and essential amino acid profile. And animal proteins in that regard tend to be superior, that they tend to have a higher leucine and higher EAA content. But the thing is, from the standpoint of kidney function and acidity, the vegan proteins seem to be much less detrimental. And it has to do with the type of amino acid profile. I think they're less in amino acids like cysteine, which are acid forming in the body. So one of the things I've done this year is I've switched up some of my protein, whey protein, to alternating it with plant-based protein sources.
Yeah.
And I was doing 1 day a week. I was actually doing a vegan day. Like
Mhm.
I've stopped doing that in the last couple of months, but I probably will go back to doing it. I was doing 1 day a week where I was just eating no meat, just
Yeah.
to help reduce some of that acidic load. So it's probably not a bad idea to mix protein sources to increase intake of plant-based protein sources to supplement. You need a little bit more to get the same anabolic effect, but to be honest, it's negligible.
Yeah.
You know, plant-based protein sources also appear to be better, and just plant-based diet for the most part tends to be better for the gut microbiome as well,
Yeah.
because two of the meats and grains and sugars for the most part don't tend to be very great for the microbiome, you know.
Yeah.
So having nutrient diversity is always a good thing as well for promoting good gut microbiome health.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, potentially mitigating this dietary acid load. Because the problem is, you know, a lot of these shorter studies, they don't tell us anything. Yeah, it's like sometimes the damage can be done from months or years on end of eating a certain way. And a lot
Yeah.
of these 8 to 12 week interventions just don't tell us that, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. I also think to contribute to a healthy gut is really just comes down to variety in the foods you're eating overall. If you're eating the same type of foods day to day with little to no variety, especially with the micronutrients, you may not be so fond of eating vegetables, but having like different types of foods, the variety in the fruits, if you're going to incorporate them, the meats, the grains, and all of that will help create a healthier gut bacteria. And I think oftentimes that gets confused when people switch to something like vegan. They might not be eating a higher variety, but then you have vegans that are eating a higher variety. Same thing with people who are eating meat. And it just really comes down to that variety of food. I think sometimes can be the source of a lot of gut issues that I've seen with my own clients. And the minute we started incorporating, more diverse food and just having, eating the rainbow quite literally, not in Skittles. Sometimes we can squeeze the Skittles in, but I'm talking about like
the
colors and
placeholders as
nutrients.
well, yeah.
Yeah, it really just helps with increasing that healthy gut bacteria. One of the things I wanted, we touched on protein, but I wanted to hear insight on what about like nutrition periodization when it comes to carbohydrates, things like carb cycling, calorie cycling. What role do carbohydrates play in hypertrophy?
Um, so if you look at like the acute studies on even some of the chronic studies, like technically, as we said, insulin is important for disposing of the amino acids into the cells, but protein intake alone triggers a large enough insulinogenic response to be able to do that.
Yeah,
So if you look at, for example, some of the studies on post-workout carbohydrate intake with the protein, they do not seem to augment the anabolic response.
yeah,
Now, having said that, you always have to be skeptical of certain studies because the average participant in the study is a uni student doing 3 sets of 10 on bicep curl or a leg
yeah,
extension. That is hardly enough to generate any type of real stress response in the body. Where I actually see the value of carbs, also look to be honest too, like you probably don't need to go ultra high on carbohydrate, but having a moderate amount of carbohydrate, muscle glycogen, just to have your muscle glycogen levels topped up. There is data to show that when muscle glycogen levels are low, anaerobic performance is compromised, especially when you're doing like reps of 5 or over. Anaerobic performance is compromised. There was one study that looked at a group of participants doing max reps at 80% of their squat, 80% of 1RM squat, and they did it once in a glycogen depleted state and then another in a glycogen loaded state. The difference was in the glycogen depleted state, they got 7 reps. In the glycogen loaded state, they got 10 reps.
mhm,
That's a
yeah,
difference of 3 reps. That's a lot of reps. Like over time, that could add up to the stimulus that you're able to deliver through each training session.
yeah,
The other thing is too, training in a glycogen, like cell swelling is potentially, like when you have cell swelling, you can increase the tension of those mechanoreceptors. Okay, so
Yeah.
when you have more muscles that are full of glycogen, and this is probably one of the mechanisms through which creatine can also increase anabolism, is by increasing cellular swelling. You're able to, when you're then contracting the muscles and getting a pump, you're able to exert a greater tension on those on the mechanoreceptors. And there has been studies too that, so yeah, having carb, like full muscle glycogen levels helps with that. And there's also some data that shows when you glycogen levels are low, protein turnover increases significantly during training.
Yeah.
So I think it's, you want to at least maintain, for optimal muscle building stimulus, you want to maintain glycogen levels topped up. And that usually for most people, probably about 3 grams of carbohydrate per kilo per day.
Hmm.
Um, Now, the post workout, as I said, where I see value in carbohydrate post workout is basically if you've done a hard workout, your noradrenaline, adrenaline levels are going to be high, cortisol levels are going to be high. You want to suppress cortisol, noradrenaline as quickly as possible. You want to get yourself out of that, flight or fight state into a parasympathetic state and start initiating recovery, right? So yeah, if you've got a uni student doing 3 sets of 10 on bicep curl, they're hardly generating what I would call a stress response that would warrant any intake of carbohydrate post workout.
Yeah.
Now take a serious bodybuilder on the other hand, pumping out 15 sets of hard like leg work in a session. That's going to generate quite a hefty stress response.
Yeah.
And you want to bring down cortisol. This is why Poliquin, for example, is so big on post-workout carb intake. And he would slam down, like, he was recommending ridiculous amounts. I think he was recommending up to 2 grams per kilo post-workout. And his whole rationale was just to, suppress cortisol as rapidly as possible, come out of that catabolic state.
Yeah.
But he worked with elite athletes, guys that are training really hard. So I think it's one of those things where it's context dependent. There has been a couple of studies. So if we look at like post peri workout carbohydrate intake or supplementation, I'll be honest, the majority of studies don't seem to show an effect, right? But there has been a handful of studies, probably not even a handful, maybe about 3 or so that I can think of, that did show a benefit to intra or post workout carbohydrate intake. That tells me that at least in some cases it works. So I'm not going to write it off because at least in some cases it works. And it's, to be honest, it's probably in most of those cases where you have someone training hard and someone also performing a substantial amount of volume.
Yeah.
There was one study that showed that you won't get a benefit out of intra or post workout carbohydrate intake until you're hitting around 15 sets or so per body part. Now, that's
Yeah.
quite excessive volume. I probably wouldn't recommend for people to get to that level unless you're doing maybe an overreaching phase.
Yeah.
But there is certain instances where, it can be beneficial. The thing you have to realize too is where that whole thing stemmed from, intra-workout, post-workout carbs, was largely from Milos Sarcev and John Meadows and a lot of guys that are taking insulin around training. When
Yeah.
you're taking insulin around training, you absolutely must, or
Yeah.
you're going to go hypoglycemic and go into a coma, So it's an absolute must. But for your average natural trainee, doing a good, like just doing maybe 8 hard sets, probably not needed, not essential to slam down carbs post-workout, intra-workout. But if you're in like an overreaching phase or hard training phase, you're getting up to 15 sets per body part, you may benefit from it. Also, I tend to, if you have like what I call like high catechol phenotype, so that's someone who naturally has a higher cortisol or noradrenaline response,
Yeah.
they may benefit too from intra or post workout carbs, because that helps shut that. Because some people will turn on the stress response. Some people and they naturally have a harder time shutting off that stress response. That has to do with the chemical. There's certain enzymes like COMT enzyme, MAOA enzyme that break down and detoxify our catecholamines, right?
Yeah.
So when you really make dopamine, when you make noradrenaline, these chemicals are then cleared from the synapses in the brain, either by reuptake transporters or either by enzymes that go and break them down. And some people naturally have an impaired ability to clear out these chemicals. So once they turn on the stress response, they have a very hard time turning off the stress response. It's harder for them to come out of it. So in those instances, taking post or intra-workout carbs, taking some magnesium or glycine post workout can just help them come out of that and start initiating. Because the quicker you can come out of that flight or fight state, that being in flight or fight state for too long is actually very catabolic and destructive to the body. And one of my personal theories, if you look at hard gainers, right, one of the things that makes hard gainer a hard gainer is they naturally tend to be stress heads. And that's the thing, no one ever got jacked stressing. And that's
Yeah.
because if you're always stressing your cortisol level, and that's why I said for me earlier when we started this call and you asked me about my history, and I said these days I build muscle easily, but that wasn't always the case, is because naturally I am a stress head. I've just trained myself not to be. I was the guy that thought if I miss one meal, I would turn into Woody Allen. Or if I went to the gym and I didn't make progress, I would lose my shit and chuck weights. And I had that identity, that I'm the hard gainer, that I have to try, like muscle building comes hard to me, that I have to struggle. And I think like being a stress head and having high cortisol, noradrenaline levels all the time at base, that's just a very catabolic and destructive state to be in, right? You want to spend most of your time out of the gym being in parasympathetic state. So having interventions that help you calm down. This is why meditation is huge for me these days. I meditate a lot, and that's been one of the best things for me. But also, I just shifted my mindset years ago, probably back around 2015. That time I was telling is when I really made that mental shift that, you know what, like I'm not a hard gainer. It actually happened on the back end of, I was doing a tour with Dmitry Klokov around Europe. And what struck me was that, the whole day he would spend teaching. And then you know what he ate for the whole day? He had like one meal and a can of Coke. I think your audio went out.
What was his one meal? Sorry, my mic was off.
I can't remember, but he would literally have one meal and a can of Coke the whole day. And I was sitting there going, you got to be shitting me. Like I'm sitting here stressing about missing one meal. And this guy's like eating one meal the whole day and he's teaching and he's just, he's still jacked 110 kilos. And I said, you know what? Like, I said, and that's the moment I literally made a decision at that moment with such firm intent that I think like I changed in that moment where I said, I'm not going to be the hard gain. I'm not going to stress about dumb shit, about missing meals, about,
Yeah.
if I'm going to stress and make cortisol, I'm going to make cortisol to get more reps in the gym.
Yeah,
And
not stress about things like
And
that.
you
Yeah.
see this with a lot of the hard gainers. They literally get bogged down into the details and stress the really minute things. They're the guys, like I said, that are bitching that I'm using loose form. They should be spending their time training instead of like looking at some guy on the internet and like trying to pick apart his form.
Yeah.
Um,
I
it's
think nowadays everybody kind of just overcomplicates everything because there is so much information. It's like information overload. And it's like at the end of the day, for most people, unless you're like very advanced and have been lifting for decades plus, like the basics are going to take you very far. And it's just
most
mastering
people.
those basics. And
And that's the thing. The basics are hard though. That's why people shy
yes,
away from the basic. It's because they're fucking hard. But if you look at
yes,
my programs, and my clients will attest this too, it's like a lot of times my programs are quite simple, and they work because the only thing I care about is getting my clients like, as we said.
yeah,
So you don't strength and hypertrophy are not necessarily correlated, but gains in strength on a program are correlated to hypertrophy. If you're getting
yeah,
stronger, that is your best sign that 4 reps that what you're doing is actually working. You know,
yeah,
so that's still the best marker we have of progress in the gym is strength. So,
yeah,
a lot of time, I think a lot of beginner and intermediate clients, yeah, they overcomplicate it. They're training 4 days a week. They have they may have workout A for upper body, workout B, and then for lower body. I'm like, hang on a second. You
yeah.
don't need 4 different workouts. You can squat twice, even 3 times a week. Because think about it this way. Are you going to get stronger squatting once a week or squatting 2 or 3 times a week?
Probably by practicing it more.
100%. So if I get the beginners sometimes training the same lift 3 days a week, because if I can get them squatting 3 times a week and getting stronger each workout, they're going to progress that much faster than doing twice or 3 times. Eventually, I'll have to scale them back to doing, maybe a movement pattern twice a week. And
Yeah.
eventually, you may need to come to a point where you may, it wasn't, I could bench heavy twice a week up to until I got to about 140 on the bench. or
Yeah.
about 315 pounds. At that point, I could no longer recover from benching heavy twice a week. I had to switch to doing one workout lighter with dumbbells and
Yeah.
then one workout then with heavy bench. I could then get away with doing that. I got stronger. Then I got to a point when I was getting close to 400-pound bench, I was literally bench pressing heavy once every third workout. I was doing um, dumbbells, bench, heavy bench, one workout, then dumbbells next workout, then machine, and then coming back to the barbell work. But that's me like pushing sort of the limits of my genetic potential, right? There's no need to do that if you don't have to. There's no need to have to bench heavy every third workout if you can get away with doing it every single workout or
Yeah.
every second workout. So sometimes, yeah, basic is, if you can continue getting stronger on the basics, it's not easy, but yeah,
No.
it 100% works.
Yeah, I think sometimes people get caught up to try to find the latest secret, shortcut, but
100%.
all
And
the greats, all the industry leaders are mastering those basics and repeatedly doing them over and over.
and
But
all
I
the
will,
questions
yeah, go ahead.
all the questions I get on social media from people, it's always about this method, this how do I integrate 6, 12, 25 into this, or supersets or drop set. And in my head, I'm always thinking you're barking down the wrong tree. You're going for these hardcore methods. That thing, it's a lot. A lot of these methods, a lot of times, they're not even ideal. Not that they don't
Yeah,
work; they work. Like I said, anything can work
yeah,
as long as you apply progressive overload. But
exactly.
they not even maybe not even be ideal because just the amount of fatigue you're getting with those methods.
Yeah. So it again goes right back to Taylor, the more you know, the more you're able to have as a library of tools to provide for your clients. And that is why, with Clean Health, being that source of education allows you to not only master the basics, but truly understand, the science behind it, the evidence behind it, not just nutrition, training, but everything that you would need as a PT. And a lot of what we talked about is covered in our PPT course level 1, 2, and 3, and each level progresses on itself. So if you have not taken PPT, the Performance Personal Trainer certification, I can't recommend that enough. And, for our students that are listening now, this is a reminder as we're wrapping up this masterclass that Black Friday, we are on our final days. And this is our biggest sale of the year for Clean Health. And this is the perfect time to be enrolling in all of our courses. You could save up to 60%. So whether it's PPT, performance nutrition, we have our specialization non accredited courses. Or if you're looking to literally master the basics and become a qualified PT, now is the perfect time. Stefan is the man behind a lot of the courses that you will be taking. So you may hear a familiar sound when you are listening to some of the lectures, but don't forget Black Friday is still live. And also, we touched on this at the beginning, but live events are coming back. Stefan is going to be back on tour as well, including myself here in the States. If you guys want to see our full lineup, you can head over to our website and lock in our Black Friday sale for tickets, because once that's over, those prices are going to be locked in as is. So this is the chance to get those early bird deals. But Stefan, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you about one
Thank
of your
you.
favorite topics,
Enjoyed
and
it.
looking forward to our next conversation as we can
Definitely.
dive in
I
a little
mean,
bit
there's
deeper
so
now.
much more we could have covered, but you just can't in 2 hours. This is impossible. So, guys, yeah, really think about getting those courses, coming to the live events.
Yeah.
We'd love to see you there.
And like Stefan said, it's really hard to cover everything in 2 hours. But if you guys want us to dive into specifics, don't hesitate to comment, whether you're watching this on YouTube, on our Facebook group, on Instagram, to myself and Stefan. We will be hosting future master classes, and we want to be diving in deeper. So this is our Hypertrophy 101 class. And now we're going to be able to get into some of the lectures a little bit more sciencey, a little bit more evidence, providing you actual presentations. But this was kind of just like the overview. So Stefan, always a pleasure getting to chat with you, learning from
Thank you,
you,
Maria.
and we cannot
Appreciate
wait
it.
for our next masterclass.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.